morning. Welcome to the Complex Games Apologists review of Star Trek Adventures role-playing game.
This is a 2x20 system game, but what does that really mean?
I think that the 2x20 system goes further, stretches longer into the genres that it seeks to inhabit. To judge the system as a whole and to describe it as a whole is a challenge that I'm not up for, and I'm not going to confront how the system talks about Conan or Infinity or Mutant Chronicles all that much, because I think that the specific implementation that we see in Star Trek Adventures is worth considering as a game unto itself. With that said, let's start talking about the core PDF of Star Trek Adventures, and that's where this particular review is going to be laser focused, because I think that the challenge of introducing a game and whether it conveys the kind of information that it really needs to succeed and to tell the players and the game master what kind of game this intends to be, well, I think that for that to work, it has to succeed in a single document. So, let's get going. This PDF is very tightly focused around a single goal, which is communicating and explaining and vamping the ideals of Starfleet. It's meant to excite players, to tell them that being a Starfleet officer, and being a Starfleet officer in a game that's focused on the stories of Starfleet and its core ideals, is something exciting and something that will be fun at your tabletop. So that means that the first 70 pages of this book are really just an exploration of that fluff, of that universe, and from a particular perspective of talking about the values and the ideals. And most of it is from the perspective of a captain talking to him about how his crew's motivations and where they come from and who they are. And I think that that's a really good way to approach it. It's an in-universe explanation. The rules of the game are interestingly complex in their own way. I think the 2x20 system at its core is something that wants to be a great deal like Fate and Savage Worlds, but introduce the kind of numerical granularity, the kind of design depth within the system to be able to leverage things that are a little more complicated and to give the potential for a game that is a little bit longer.
So here is a basic explanation of the 2d20 system. I'm going to keep it very brief. You pick up 2d20. You consider the action that you're taking, and the game master tells you an attribute and a discipline. You add the two together, and you get a value somewhere between 12 and 15 or so. You're looking to roll under that number to reach the difficulty of the task. Any additional successes, roll unders, go into the momentum pool, where they can be spent on various effects, now or later. The momentum is shared among the group. Any particularly high rolls, well, they will lead to complications. Those complications can be immediate dangers or threats to your character, which could cause stress, or they can go into the threat pool, which is like the game master's side of momentum. Your character's values power their determination, and that determination can give you automatic successes. 2d20 isn't the only number of dice that you might be rolling, though. From focus, from departments on your ship, and from aid that you're receiving from your companions, that number can escalate higher. But there is a maximum, and the more dice you roll, the more chance of complication there is. So, it's a balancing act, and it's one which revolves around the difficulty of the task and how often the Game Master calls for a roll. Difficulty 0 tasks are within the Game Master's prerogative to say, no rolling today. Or, he could say, go ahead and roll, and that could generate momentum for the group. There's a lot of knots tied around more parts of the system, and they're the sorts of things that I could go into greater depth if there's interest on the channel about. But that should serve as a very brief explanation of the core mechanic of this system.
So, with that said, the core explanation of what the rules system is, I find to be incredibly terse. Perhaps this is because the game and the designers are avoiding any of the bellwethers of complexity that might turn folks off. They're trying to make this as succinct as possible. It could be why the fan community is being left to create the cheat sheets and the explanations and to kind of enliven the first experience of play so that people are more prepared. It could be that. And I think that in large part, it's also owing to the choice that was made about how to lay out the volume. It's really compatible with print, but I think that really what they wanted to do was make something that would work on something like an iPad, something that would be really slick and viewable and be as much like Star Trek as the folks holding those personal access data devices. That said, that also means that there's not as many opportunities for call-outs, smaller boxes of text, or examples. And that's part of why I find this explanation of the rules a little bit sterile. But that could also be because they don't want to burden the game too much. And in fact, that's one of the things that I love about the art style that it adopted. It's all digital paintings, it's all newly contracted artwork. And I think that that's not only welcome, but awesome, because it means that there's not any baggage or any feeling of datedness. There's no time warp to the 90s that might be happening if they use stills from the television shows. And the default era is the Next Generation era, because it's the place where there's the most content, and it's the place where most people's childhood experiences will be informing them about the rules of the universe. So that's probably a good call. At the same time, there's a lot of younger folks, and there's a lot of people very new to Star Trek who might think that Star Trek is all about what we saw in the J.J. Abrams movies. They are action films. Some folks will say that they're really more or less Star Wars movies with a different logo on them. I wouldn't be so harsh myself, but I would say that there's a lot of conflict between these two fan bases, and in large part, the newer fan base, which is interested in the movies, isn't necessarily hostile to the ideas of peace and exploration that are core to what a really fun Star Trek role-playing game is, as far as why I've wanted to run them in the past. The utopianism and the optimism are something which can be communicated through the text, and this art that we see in the book is splashy. It's got some really big, high value and high budget events happening in it. And they seem like the sort of things, if you subtly look at the postures of these protagonists, if you look at what they're doing, they're not shooting guns, and they're not in fistfights. They're doing the things that we saw our beloved protagonists of the Next Generation era doing. They're holding their tricorders, they're rescuing civilians, they're being the good guys. So, don't take too much away from these art pieces without considering more of the messaging. And I think that's going to make for something which is genuinely Star Trek, regardless of where your passion for those newer movies lies. So, hold on, I think I'm getting a phone call. Oh, hi, former me. Oh, you said that you had a lot of reservations about this system. There was a couple of things that you thought that this game really needed to get right, and you weren't seeing it in the playtest. Oh, okay. Well, I'm going to let you go now. Here's the thing. I had some reservations about red shirts, about the idea that supporting characters are very crucial. They're very important to what Star Trek is. There's lots of scenes where there's population of other folks buzzing around. And there's a really robust set of rules for that. But supporting characters is something which is explored and honored. And if you like Nurse Chapel, if you like Reginald Barclay, if you like the many folks that have made guest appearances as Starfleet officers, and you'd like them to be part of your game, you will get the tools to do so.
There are several tools for character advancement in Star Trek Adventures. The first is the milestone system, which encourages the game master and the group to have focused episodes and focused stories around characters, much in the same way that there were Riker episodes, Geordi episodes, Beverly episodes, and Jean-Luc episodes. And those milestones can accumulate and get you traditional progress within your character. Now there's only 6 attributes and 6 disciplines, and a relatively small number of talents at the moment. So that's a fairly narrow path to go down. But keep in mind, there have always been a history of ships getting retrofitted and minor characters ascending through the ranks and becoming fixtures on the show, and there's so many other paths that this show, the ship, the player group, the party, if you will, can develop along, that I think there's plenty of meat and potatoes available for a campaign in this game.
Let's move on to a second one of my hang-ups, one of my reservations that I saw about this game. I was worried that the transporter and many other kind of specific objects of technology were not getting the coverage about what the rules that pertain to them were. And I think that, a lot of folks have seen really fundamentally rules-less transporters in the more recent films. And so, as it's a device for Deus Ex Machina, as it's a device of get out of jail free, I was worried. But essentially, because the 2d20 system starts out with a character rolling 2 die 20, and generally the biggest source for additional dice comes from fellow characters aiding, that means that there's going to be a lot of time consumed setting up a successful transport, because it's difficulty 2 as a default, as in 2 successes, 2 roll unders. And the complication rule, the idea that if you roll a 20, or in some cases anything between a 16 and a 20 at the highest probability, complications are dangerous to characters. And so there's places in the design space where I think that it works without being too specific. And you as the game master have the discretion to throw in a trait to the transporter system, a trait to the target, a trait to the situation. And these traits can add to the difficulty. That's the way that the system is laid out. It's one of those places where I think that it's a little lean on examples, right where it introduces the concept. But at the same time, it does mean it introduces all its concepts in a relatively few span of pages, which could be for the best. Take it or leave it, I think this game could be more specific. But my complaints about the transporter I find mooted by the way that the system interacts with these things. And then I was really concerned about role-playing. My own efforts to get people to want to play Star Trek were difficult because I was using universal systems. I had thought about using Fate even, which is not something I normally would do. And my previous efforts hung up on the fact that some folks weren't Star Trek fans, and they didn't really find a great attraction to the Starfleet ethos, or they didn't know where the vamp and the sex appeal of this universe was because they saw a couple of few episodes of Star Trek on TV that were maybe on the lower budget end of things, or not particularly high excitement. Well, I think that those first 70 pages that are rules-less resolve a great deal of that. And they do so in a way that I find relevant and modern. And I have often wondered if Star Trek in its present state is really not compatible with this age because it's so utopian and so optimistic. Well, I think that a lot of those questions have answers from the perspective of the authors of these books, and they're good answers. And they may inspire new folks to inhabit that world and those ideals. And that's a really good thing. So, my final hang-up was character advancement. And I think this is where the system really drills down into how it thinks that it should be played. I talked about how there's really not a whole lot of arcs to go down. And I thought that it was very strange that they weren't playtesting character advancement. Well, it comes down to the value system. Your values are how you get determination, and determination is how you get automatic successes. It's a lot like Bennies in Fate, or Inspiration in 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons. And those values, they can change over time. You want to be conflicted, and you want the conflicts to come up in the course of regular play. So the closer that your values cleave to the core activities of the game, the more chance that you're going to get to call out those values. This is a modern take, I find, on the idea of nature and demeanor from the World of Darkness system. And I think it might just work, especially because values can be acquired over time, they can evolve over time and be reworded. And lots of values create a fraught and complex character that needs to be developed over time, and yet has more opportunities to gain determination and to push the story forward, as our protagonists, as they mature, tend to in these television shows. And at the same time, They present the idea that advancing the technology of Starfleet, advancing the technology of the universe, is a core activity that characters can aspire to. And after all, metaphasic shielding, skeletal locks for transporters, the litanies go on and on. And in some cases, I had been offended in the past about how they really stretched the limits of what particular devices could do to the point where they were just story devices. But taken from the perspective of the characters and the perspective of your game, if you start at one point and you end at another, and it's through the direct actions of the characters upon the story, well, all of that good advice about how to advance transporter technology, shuttlecraft technology, warp technology, there's a lot of good thought put into how to confront that topic. Well, let's talk about all of the peripheral stuff that Modiphius wants to sell with their license. The miniatures, the dice, the greebly-groblies. Well, there's a lot of good stuff already out there. And the interesting thing is that I think that this is a pretty narrative system that doesn't necessarily need miniatures to play with. And I find it pretty odd that they've chosen to make miniatures not of generic crew members, but of specific personalities in the Star Trek universe. And so if you want to be, a gold shirt lieutenant that is a Vulcan, you're out of luck with these miniatures. And I think that sort of works at cross purposes to the idea of creating your own unique character that you want to play in this universe, which is a core conceit of most genre role-playing systems. Really, more than miniatures on the grid, tracking these quantities and seeing them slide across the table is the currency of this game. And it's the drama of the storytelling, of the television storytelling, that it wants you to inhabit and to share as a player group. It's a traditional game with a game master and player characters, and it succeeds in that respect while also being a narrativist game, one that is all about creating television stories with building excitement, building danger, and cathartic resolutions, and hopefully characters that evolve over time, if attention is paid to that. And there are the openings for that to occur. Of course, some characters became static in Star Trek. Some stories fell flat. But when the shows shined, they shined brightly, like a supernova in the sky. And I think that there's every opportunity and every opening for your role-playing of Star Trek to be thus, using this game. And considering that up to now, Star Trek role-playing has only been successful as something rules-less in forms among the Trekkie community and less so among the role-playing community, perhaps this is the opening. I'm the Complex Games apologist, and if you are interested as a subscriber to my channel in more content about Star Trek adventures, and me developing things and assigning traits and creating mechanics around these things in the 2D20 system, then go ahead and leave a comment below, leave a like right here, and stay tuned for more. So this is a positive review, in case you were wondering.